Welcome and good morning, afternoon, evening. I'm Hannah Shea, World Law Group's Manager of Communications and Network Development. Thank you for joining us on today's webinar on trade relations and top trade priorities around the globe. Before we jump into the topic, I wanted to give a quick overview of World Law Group for those of you who may not be familiar with our network. World Law Group is a leading network of independent law firms across the globe. 9 member firms, World Law Group has more than 21,000 lawyers in our network across 89 countries and 419 offices. We collaborate globally in our 15 practice and industry groups, and in 2019, shared more than 2,900 referrals among our member firms. World Law Group is ranked one of a few elite law firm networks according to Chambers and Partners, which is one of the most renowned legal directories in the world. World Law Group member firms are qualified trusted advisors. The network's invitation-only membership policy ensures our member firms are of the caliber that other members and their clients expect and deserve. Our member firms have developed close relationships and have an in-depth knowledge of each other's capabilities and experience, resulting in a lasting trust built among our carefully selected World Law Group members. World Law Group provides immediate access to the expertise of legal professionals in major business centers worldwide via a single phone call to any one of our members. Our members are deeply established and respected firms in their markets with in-depth knowledge of the local business community, customs, and culture. For more information on our network, feel free to visit our website at theworldlawgroup.com. Now let's get to the webinar. I'm going to hand this over to our moderator to introduce our speakers and get us started. A quick note about Q&A. We will offer Q&A at the end of the presentation, and I ask that you please type in your questions via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom toolbar. Our moderator will see these questions and ask them to the panelists. So without further ado, I introduce you to Carlos Patron.
Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to the World Law Group Trade Webinar. I have a little echo, somebody has the microphone on.
Can we find?
Can you hear that echo? Okay, that's better, thank you. Okay, so welcome to the World Law Group Trade Webinar. Today we have for you a truly global panel of distinguished trade specialists from around the world, covering the Americas, both North and South, the EU, Eastern Europe, and Asia. Joining us today are Kathleen Murphy from Frager Drinker in the US, Vera Canas from Tassini Freire in Brazil, Michael Brugman from Taylor Wessing in Germany, Georgie Danilaya from CMS Russia, and Lingcheng Piu from Songlu in China. Together, we will be addressing several hot topics related to global trade relations and top trade priorities throughout various regions. I want to jump straight into the discussion and open it up with Michael Brugman. Michael is a partner at Taylor Wessing, and his practice focuses, among others, in the EU trade and European trade and WTO foreign trade. And the first question we'd like to address today, which has been on everybody's mind over the last 6-7 months, is how has this global pandemic influenced or affected the global supply chain, and what should we expect? What changes should we expect the global supply chain to have in the foreseeable future?
Yeah, thank you very much, Carlos, and welcome and good afternoon to everybody from Germany. And in fact, as you have indicated, the COVID-19 pandemic has far-reaching consequences going beyond the spread of the disease itself and the efforts to quarantine it. In particular, the pandemic caused the largest global recession in history, with more than a third of the global population being placed on lockdown. And of course, in terms of trade, it also has laid bare the vulnerabilities of globalized supply chains and has the potential to accelerate the deglobalization trends. In addition, we face tremendous challenges from the escalating competition between the superpowers USA and China. From an EU perspective, the pandemic has in particular revealed the major disadvantages of over-reliance on global supply chains, which we have in the past, in the near past, where we had very high degrees of globalized supply chains. And for the EU, this in particular applies to certain sectors which are highly dependent on inputs from China. So for instance, textiles with 46%, electrical equipment, and also electronic products with about 40% of import rates. And this alone shows that we as the EU and even more Germany are very much depending on global supply chains. And what of course became apparent due to the pandemic is that also in terms of medicinal products like masks, there is a high dependence on imports as well. And there, Germany and other member states had the difficulties to procure these masks, which in the meantime got easier again. Things get easier, but in March, April, it was very, as you know, it was very difficult to procure these masks. And at that time, in the EU and Germany, decisions have been made to, at least in terms of medicinal products, to reshore production in terms of protection products like masks, but also in terms of pharmaceuticals. And there have been some concrete efforts like the increase of the level of FDI control in order to secure this reshoring of certain industries in order to decrease the dependence from imports. But in spite of that, from the EU perspective, it remains to be seen whether this present political skepticism towards global supply chains will lead to a major change of supply chains, because overall the EU is very much depending on these global supply chains, and therefore overall it is more likely that we will have some reshores in certain industries and areas, but at a general level, I think the level of globalization and supply change will remain quite high. And therefore, I guess the change resulting from this pandemic may not be that big. In the present, or currently, we see that the recession is not that big as expected beforehand. And so I think more will depend on other fields. And I mentioned the competition between the US and China, which has significant impacts on global trade. So at least for the EU, it needs to be considered that the EU has a very globalized and integrated economy and supply chain, and therefore is to a certain extent dependent on these supply chains, and therefore is not in a position to introduce significant changes on it. So that's at least the conclusion from the EU perspective.
Okay, thank you, Michael. You did mention the U.S. and China and the relationships right now. China is, of course, one of the world's, if not the world's largest trading partner. And I'd like to turn our attention now to Ling Cheng. Ling Cheng is a counsel at uh, Songlung in China. Lingcheng has decades of experience in foreign trade, probably defended hundreds of trade remedy investigations all over the world. So I'd like to ask Lingcheng's perspective on the same issue. Are you as optimistic? Do you think that the global supply chain has reestablished itself, and what do you see? Or do you see changes, or long-lasting changes in the global supply chain in the foreseeable future?
Thank you very much, Carlo. Good evening from Beijing. It's the evening in China, 9:15. Very happy to be here to have this opportunity to exchange the views on this very important subject. As we know, every virus could last for a while, but not for long. We had this kind of similar situations before. The virus move around the world, but this time, the COVID-19 pandemic seems to be affecting the world so badly. And almost every corner of the world, nearly all family lives are being affected. So why people are so concerned about this, how the pandemic influenced the global economy and supply chains? I give 2 examples. One, when Wuhan city in China was locked down to prevent the virus spreading further, a car producer in Korea was immediately suffered as such a result because supplies of car parts could not be provided. A domino effect brought up. Some of the supplies of the car parts were cut off. So this is very bad for the car producers in Korea because the Korean car producer heavily rely on the supplies of car parts produced in that very well-known city of Wuhan. The second example is that because of the rapid spread of pandemic, countries that were not initially affected and had some medical devices, face masks, provided to the countries, the most affected countries, such as China. However, along with the development of a pandemic around the world, some countries began to impose export control concerning the medical devices and the face masks. There seems to appear a tendency to be inward instead of outward. I call it home supply becomes priority. What such policy of a home country supply first affect the global change? I believe that the pattern and the structure of the supply chain may be modified to adapt quickly to such unexpected event taking place in future. Although it is the pandemic, this event alert the worldwide business communities how we needed to reorganize, restructure the supply chain. Do we have to rely on one country or one region to obtain the most important critical part of the car parts, like what happened to the Korean producers? So I think that the supply chain is rooted in optimizing the use of resources, labor divisions, comparative advantages. those elements that could, in fact, naturally change the module of supply chain. But in face of this pandemic, the supply chain that used to be set up to turn around the business and to set up the cooperation among all different countries apparently affected. So in my view, depending on the specific industry, supply chain could become more broadly deployed or narrowed down to a certain area or region. For example, maybe one country, for instance, the EU, before relying on China, the supply from China, 80%. And now probably they try to redeploy their supply chain, maybe move some part of the supply chain from China alone to some Asian countries in order to adapt a certain quick changes affecting this established supply chain. So in my view, legally speaking, we could say the regional arrangement, bilateral agreements will be developed very fast in order to also cope with the change of supply chain. That's my view, Carol. Thank you.
Very interesting. We will touch on some of these topics, I think, further on in the webinar. Yes, so COVID has been like a tsunami to the world trade system, but there's been a storm brewing overhead for the last couple of years. We've all witnessed a drastic change in U.S. policies towards international trade during this period. So I'd like to address this question now to Kathleen. Kathleen is a partner at Frager Drinker in the U.S. She's a chamber-ranked specialist, a trade specialist, counseling clients in foreign trade issues of a wide variety of topics. And Kathy is our World Law Group's International Trade Chair, co-chair of our practice group since 2017. So she has a lot of experience in these matters. We've been witnessing the U.S. leaning towards inward protectionism over the last 3 years. Just last month, the U.S. announced a safeguard investigation to blueberries from Latin America, which hits close to home here, which is a remedy that has been hardly attempted in the U.S. in the last 25 years. And this doesn't seem to appear to be solely a Trump initiative, since it has bipartisan support. So this leaves everybody wondering, what is the likely impact of this new election process on trade policies? I don't know what you think, Kathleen.
Great. Thank you so much, Carlos, and welcome everyone to the webinar. Hannah, if you could work my slides, I'd appreciate that. So we're going to talk about the impact of the 2020 election, which is weeks away from today, and I'm going to kind of break it down into 3 components. First of all, just the candidates' general approach to international trade. We're going to touch a bit on the relationship with China, and then talk about what's going on with trade agreements as a result of the different candidates' viewpoints. So, starting out, just a general approach. It's interesting to note that both candidates, and probably very difficult to believe that this is true, but both candidates do have some overlapping agreements when it comes to U.S. foreign trade policy, although they do have divergent views on certain things. Both of them believe that the U.S.-China trade relationship needs to be fixed, needs to be addressed. They both believe that it's important that U.S. manufacturing be buttressed and supported, and also by American rules in terms of favoring a certain percentage of U.S. origin inputs in the production of goods. Their approach, however, is different. As you know, President Trump has blamed the trade system on large trade deficits that it has run with virtually every single country that's being represented, certainly on this webinar today, and many, many more. So it's the large trade deficit the United States is running, more imports than exports. In addition, declining U.S. manufacturing, steel, aluminum, certain examples of that, and also offshoring of American jobs. And so those are the concerns. In the case of President Trump, he has a very impulsive decision-making manner. Even his trade advisors aren't sure when he's going to switch and take on a different position. Vice President Biden is a longtime supporter of trade liberalization and lowering the barriers to commerce worldwide, in particular protecting U.S. workers, and not just U.S. workers, but also, for example, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Free Trade Agreement. Vice President Biden was very supportive and very concerned about making sure that Mexican workers also had certain protections when it came to that particular agreement. Right now, though, behind the scenes, the Biden campaign team, they're struggling between globalism versus economic nationalism. Right now, they tend to be inclined towards economic nationalism. Why? Because of the swing states. 4 years ago, it was 4 states that determined the outcome of the election: Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And so, to a great extent, the Biden campaign team is keeping that close to its vest, if you will. Let's take a look at the next slide, talk about China. As I said, both President Trump and Vice President Biden agreed that U.S. trading relationships must be addressed and must be fixed. They are concerned about unfair subsidizing of Chinese companies when it comes to wheat and rice, for example, and also lack of strong intellectual property protection when it comes to China, as well as cyber attacks. So these are all things that both camps are focused on. As we saw, the approach that the president took roughly 4 years ago is to assess tariffs on close to $600 billion in Chinese goods. And the Chinese, of course, in turn retaliated on U.S. goods. So there is this so-called trade war. That's where that, designation really develops. What's interesting is 2 weeks ago, 3,300 U.S. importers in the United States filed a lawsuit in the Court of International Trade challenging the legality of these tariffs. So that is something that is just happened about a week and a half ago. We are representing about 120 companies in that litigation. So it's something right now that has captured a lot of attention. Vice President Biden believes the U.S. must reduce its dependence on China, understands, though, that there is a strong relationship, a human relationship, if you will, when it comes to, just as Ling Chen pointed out, critical products such as medicine and personal protective equipment, such as masks and gowns and booties and things along those lines. So that's not lost on Vice President Biden, and it most likely what his approach will be is to start neutralizing, putting an end to these high tariffs, and instead working with China on existing trade laws through the WTO, and also building a united front with its allies, which have suffered tremendously under the Trump administration. Quickly, the last component I want to discuss is just the next slide, please, is multilateral trade agreements. As everyone knows, President Trump was wholehearted against multilateral trade agreements. He feels that the United States always gets the short shrift of things. So he has turned his back on that, but he has been quite interested and engaged in bilateral trade agreements. Right now, he's looking at a potential agreement with India. A bilateral trade agreement with the EU is back on the table, with UK back on the table, whereas, a year ago that simply just was not the situation at all. Vice President Biden, I should say, he again is concerned about the existing trade laws that exist in already existing multilateral trade agreements. He does want to modernize those trade agreements, but he is also looking for better enforcement when it comes to foreign trade agreements. His main concern, and he will start negotiating free trade agreements, not right away. It's not his top priority, but it is something that definitely in the first year of his administration, if that's what happens, you will see an interest to get back into, for example, the trade agreement in Asia Pacific, TPP. I know it's not called that any longer. And also, as I said, Europe, the Middle East, as well as Africa. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen. I'd like to turn it over to Ling Cheng since we have discussed, since China is so critical in the U.S. and in Trump's rhetoric right now. What are your impressions, or what is the Chinese perspective on the upcoming U.S. elections and its impact on trade?
Thank you, Carlo. Sorry. I think on this subject, Catherine would have more to say than I do. As you know, China today is in a very difficult situation. No China, no news. Every time you turn on the TV, China, US. Every time you listen to the radio, China, US. And every time you go everywhere, China. If I walk around the streets in Europe, people give me the dirty look, say, hey, these Chinese, they spread the COVID-19 pandemic. If I try to spend money there, they say, hey, this Chinese guy has money. They are really benefit from our system. Anyway, it's very difficult, Carlo. Everybody, of course, is concerned about the US election, what would happen on China's trade policy. It's a very difficult question, and it's very difficult for me to give very useful opinions, because it's hard to predict, and we can only analyze what's happening today. So we can see that the president, Mr. President Trump, has already constantly applied a combined trade policies to contain the development of China for very clear purposes and reason. I don't know, for example, if Biden becomes the president, the overall trade policies towards China will be changed? I doubt. And what China would do in facing of this US election, I think it's very difficult. Let me see, for example, the President Trump is thinking that today's multilateral rules-based trading system failed to work, especially for the interests of the US. And the US believes that this multilateral trading system brings one-sided benefits to China, and China benefited from that system, and not the US. So China, of course, in a very difficult situation, and try to encourage, promote globalization, and try to be continued opening policy, and to welcome the foreign direct investment. But of course, what the President Trump is doing, I'm sorry to use this metaphor, is simply like a person threw away chessboard. So if you play the chess, you have rules. You have certain rules, to respect in order to check in the end based on the rules. But now this chessboard being thrown away. This is different from what the EU is doing. The EU is trying to keep the chessboard, but they modify the rules. That means to keep the globalization, but not entirely overthrow this multilateral trading system. So I think it's a very, very difficult, Carlo, to say what would it affect on China trade policy? I think, of course, in China try to reach the good trade relationship with US and try to reduce the differences between these two countries and try to come to the table to negotiate a better deal, not a shoot first and then negotiate the second. This is not a way how to deal with the situation of China. And I think the election of US 2020, whoever becomes the president, for example, Biden will be in favor for globalization, but when it comes to China, the policy may design specifically tailored, to deal with China. Of course, he will also be favor of globalization by it, but Mr. Trump is a bit different. So I think in the end, whoever becomes the president, China will be the target. And the policies will be very clearly imposed to contain China. I think China will continue to open the market. As a statistic shows, I can tell everybody, the foreign direct investment over the last 5 years has been increased instead of a decline. Many people think that the foreign direct investment in China appeared declining. No, the statistics shows to the contrary. And also some of the big American companies are still planning to enter into Chinese market. So that the China, the trade policy, no matter what the result of the election of the United States, the China will continue to promote the globalization, continue to open up the market, and continue to try to cooperate with many countries as possible, and try to keep this globalization, the system work together, not bring this multilateral trading system into fragmentation that doesn't benefit anybody. Perhaps I don't know benefit the United States, but it doesn't benefit the world globalization trade. So I think China in this regard will be more cooperating with perhaps the EU and some neighboring countries, and to see what exactly will happen after this election. Will be the trade policy continuously applying in this way, or there will be a certain modification? So these two countries could sit down together and to reduce the differences in order to achieve the common understanding. That's my views, Carol. Thank you.
Thank you, Ling Cheng. Very interesting indeed. Paraphrasing an analogy you just used. So we're caught in a global chess match or a global board game with an ever-changing board and ever-changing rules right now. Sandwiched in the middle of these two giants that are playing this game is Latin America and several other developing regions. I'd like to turn our attentions to Vera Canas now, who's the head of the International Trade Practice Group at the Cine Freire in Brazil and a renowned regional trade specialist, and ask you, Vera, what do you think the prospects are for Latin America in the near future? Should we be relying more on bilateral and regional trade agreements in light of what's happening in the Northern Hemisphere? Should we be deepening regional initiatives or other type of extra zone initiatives that some way hedge the risk of what's going on in the rest of the world?
Yeah, thank you, Carlos. Well, I'll be speaking on behalf of Latin America as a whole continent and as a large group of countries. We are talking about 600 million inhabitants living in 20 countries of all sizes, from Brazil to tiny islands in the Caribbean, for example. So it's difficult to talk which would be the top trade priorities for all of them at the same time. But considering that the Latin American countries are developing countries, generally speaking, the best approach, the best scenario for these countries would be having a strong multilateral system, having a strong WTO. Because we don't have a strong WTO, we don't have a strong multilateral trading system, those countries are taking other approaches. Some of them are in a better position to take all those approaches than others. Some Latin American countries have a long background of bilateral trade, free trade agreements, or in negotiating those bilateral free trade agreements, like Chile and Mexico, for example. So they have a long-standing background for negotiations. Mexico, for example, has 14 FTAs involving more than 50 countries, and Chile has even more than that. But each country has its own characteristic. Chile, for example, has a maybe less complex industry than Brazil, for example. So, speaking about countries like Brazil or Argentina, those countries preferred always in the past to focus on Mercosur, which is a customs union. So deepening the region. The negotiations within this region with Paraguay and Uruguay. And talking about Mercosur, it has certain restrictions in terms of negotiation involving preference in tariffs and market access. So Mercosur has to negotiate as a region with other countries. This is why Mercosur executed the agreement with the EU and with EFTA in the last year, and which is challenging for the region because, for example, Brazil and Argentina have different views about several matters. And nowadays for Brazil, opening its economy through opening its trade is a top priority. Although with the economic crisis here and in other countries as well, the industry asks for more protection. So there is a protectionist approach as well. But nowadays, for example, in Brazil, there is a move towards trade, towards free trade agreements. And in Argentina, on the other hand, there is no such move. So Brazil is trying to move forwards, and Argentina is taking back. So, for example, so this is why it's so difficult for those negotiations to move. More recently, it has become a priority for Latin American countries, and negotiating all kinds of free trade agreements. So, for example, not staying only in market access. So, for example, Brazil is starting to negotiate with the US a non-market, a free trade agreement that does not involve market access. So targeting in trade facilitation and regulatory convergences and other issues that do not involve trade preferences, because Brazil would have to be taking Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay. And finally, there is also regional initiatives, extra zone, as you mentioned, like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, which Chile, Peru, and Mexico are part of it. And Colombia is interested in participating, and there was a discussion here in Brazil about participating in this initiative, which seems very interesting. But these discussions was last year's discussions, and we don't hear about this anymore. Thank you, Carlos.
Thank you, Vera. Michael, how open do you think the EU will be in the near future to further developing bilateral and multilateral trade agreements in this ever-changing context?
Sorry, I needed to unmute me. I mean, it's quite similar to the situation described by Vera for Southern America, because of course the EU had for a long time a rather multilateral approach, which I think is still our bottom line. But as everybody knows, since the 2000s, the WTO system is being kept in a stalemate, and therefore it is difficult to reach improvements for international trade on that basis, because the Doha negotiation turned out to be extremely difficult, as everybody knew, due to the hardened positions between industrialized northern countries and the developing countries. And the result was that for the last years, the EU has focused on initiating and negotiating bilateral free trade agreements. However, I think it is very important to have the stable WTO system as a bottom line for international trade, and this in particular may apply to the EU, which is the world's largest exporter, which and at the same time the largest foreign direct investor, and also the most important destination for foreign direct investment. So as I described in my initial statement, is very much depending on international trade. And also negotiating and finalizing bilateral free trade agreements is not always that easy, as for instance shown by the failure of the TTIP negotiation. Even if, as Katie described, there are new approaches to restart negotiations, which is of course very positive, even under the Trump administration. And as you know, we still have the possible no-deal Brexit scenario on the table, depending on how the negotiations will develop between the UK and the EU in the remaining year. So overall, with regard to the EU-Mercosur agreement, which we have discussed in our last webinar, and which was also teased by Vera, this is of course a huge accelerator for trade, but at the EU level, currently we have, or several governments have difficulties to get it signed and approved by their parliaments. You know, there's strong resistance by NGOs in terms of environmental protection related to the bushfires in Brazil and so, and also European farmers are strongly lobbying against the free trade agreement, because they conclude that it will, when it comes to imports of beef, for instance, it will weaken their market position, and also maybe in particular countries like Austria will maybe cause the existence of farmers, because farms are very small in Austria. And this shows and was, I think, even last week picked up by our trade commissioner at EU level, Mrs. Malmström from Sweden, and she has warned of these growing difficulties in securing the approval of free trade agreements. And also, for instance, with the talks to Australia and New Zealand, there are some environmental protection issues and sustainability issues, and also when it comes to this agreement, there is resistance by NGOs, and therefore, of course, you have growing protectionist tendencies across the EU, and but nevertheless, I think that the EU Commission itself, but also national governments like the one of Germany, and also Germany's industrial association, are strongly in favor of those free trade agreements. And of course, after all, also in favor of the WTO multilateral system, which is the basis of international trade. And I think in that regard, much will also depend on the outcome of the US election, whether it will be possible to strengthen WTO again. And also with regard to the negotiation of the bilateral agreements, in particular between the US and EU, this will of course also depend on the outcome of the election, and also of course the trilateral relationship between the US, China and the EU. You know, between China and the EU, there are negotiations going on regarding an investment agreement because as Ling Cheng described, European companies are to a large extent active in China. On the other hand, facing some difficulties, like being forced to have a joint venture. On the other hand, Chinese companies complain about a higher level of protectionism and skepticism in the EU towards Chinese investment. And I think therefore it would be important to have an agreement in that case as well, which appears to be quite difficult at the moment. Also with a view to the overall political situation, and this is a very sensitive topic, and some politicians try to use it. But I think the positive fact is that we are in discussions both with the US and China, and therefore I'm optimistic that maybe things will get better after the US election, and then we have a reinforcement of global trade, also when things in terms of COVID-19 will get better, and maybe we will have a vaccine, so allowing to normalize trades and supply chains as well in that regard. So yeah, that's my view from the European side.
Thank you, Michael. Knock on wood. Hope that's true. Both Michael and Vera have touched on the WTO. I'd like to remind attendees that they can submit their questions through the chat room. There's a Q&A section. We will try to address them either directly through the same chat room, or I'll try to put the questions out to our panelists, either during the regular questions or at the end of the webinar. There's several questions popping up, and they're all related to the same topic that Vera and Michael already touched, which is the WTO. WTO has been undermined, it's weakened, it's in a stalemate, and it's not the strong trading entity or supervisor that the world needs right now. I'd like to ask Kathleen her views, since both U.S. presidential candidates seem to have very different views on the role of these types of international organizations, and in particular the WTO. What are their opinions, and what is the likely impact of the U.S.'s standpoint on the WTO and other organizations and their efficacy moving forward?
Mm-hmm. So thank you, Carlos, for teeing that up for me. So again, here, the same situation, both candidates have very different views on the role of international organizations altogether, including the WTO. It's no secret that President Trump has threatened to withdraw the United States from the WTO. His position is that certain members have rigged the WTO by taking advantage of special rules for developing countries. So what he's alluding to here, I believe, is that under the WTO, less developed countries are entitled to preferential trade agreements, or I should say preferential trade treatment. And so there are certain countries that the United States feels are not, they're no longer considered, less developed or developing. They're already developed. They're already, would be considered, roughly on the same tangent as the United States and the EU. Canada and Mexico and other countries in Latin America. And so simply by self-declaring that they're a developing country, they are able to take advantage of these special rules. And so the United States is quite, at least the Trump administration is quite bothered by that. Also, as you know, the WTO's dispute settlement mechanism has been another target for the Trump administration. The concern here is that over the years, the 9 individuals that have been subject or appointed to the appellate body, they have taken positions that judicially overreach what the WTO laws actually state. Also, they feel as though the appellate body doesn't follow certain rules that are embedded in the WTO. An example of that is that there is a situation in the WTO guidelines where national security is at issue. The WTO member can deviate from WTO laws. And so that's a situation where the administration, for example, where there are huge import surges into the United States, such as blueberries and other types of goods, the United States has the opportunity to exempt itself from certain WTO rules when this national security exception is in play. So that's the Trump administration, and the two, let's just say, focal points with respect to the WTO. In terms of Vice President Biden, if he wins the election, his administration is likely to take more positive steps, and most likely pretty quickly, when it comes to not just the WTO, but also multilateral rules-based trading systems. It is expected that Biden will lift the blockage that the United States has put on the appellate body and will work with WTO members in getting that important aspect of the WTO up and running in a functional fashion, as well as hoping to enlist its allies to modernize various aspects of the WTO, including the appellate body. So Biden, if he's elected, I think you're going to see a very quick change with respect to the WTO, but also climate, the Paris Climate Accord as well. I think you're going to see the United States get back into that very, very quickly. So those are my thoughts and observations with respect to the two different candidates.
Okay, thank you, Kathleen. I want to turn our attention now to Georgie Danilaya, who's been quite quiet so far. Georgie is a counsel at the commercial practice of CMS in Russia and head of its Japanese desk. He has a lot of experience in trade and investment in Russia, as well as in the Russian Far East region. We're talking about WTO, bypassing the WTO, and so forth. There's a topic that I guess is sensitive for Russian trade in general, which are the EU and US economic sanctions on trade, and that were imposed several years ago and that are likely to be extended again. What are your views on these types of sanctions, and do you think that WTO rules have been violated here?
Thank you very much, Carlos, for the introduction, and greetings to everyone from Russia. I hope you can hear me well. Well, sanctions remains very hot topic to speak, and actually that's maybe the main negative factor for Russian external foreign trade relations with many other countries. And just as a brief overview or introduction, I will say a few words about sanctions and their structure. So the US and the EU sanctions were imposed against Russia after its involvement into the Ukrainian political crisis, and especially after Russia took control over the Crimean Peninsula. And they were subsequently imposed also by other countries, by Canada, by Australia, Japan, and many other countries. But those are not so important, maybe. They affect mainly bilateral trade relations and otherwise are not very sufficient. But sanctions by the US and the EU are, of course, the most severe and they're a key factor for the modern Russian economy. And it's very interesting to note that even now, even in this sanctions environment, the US continues to be the largest investor into the Russian economy among all foreign states, and the EU is the most important and the largest trade partner of Russia, and maybe more than 40% of the Russian foreign trade turnover is associated with the European Union. So the sanctions have quite complicated structure, and like so-called primary sanctions imposed by the US are consisting of blocking sanctions, which actually prohibit dealing with so-called SDN listed persons, sectoral sanctions which affect some sensitive Russian areas of economic areas, and also they include embargo against Crimea. But in my experience, the most, and European sanctions have almost the same structure, but the main difference of the European sanctions from the US sanctions is that the US sanctions can include so-called secondary sanctions, which means that even non-US persons can be sanctioned and being indicated as SDNs for dealing with Russian sanctioned persons. And in my experience, those secondary sanctions, they maybe have the most effect if we are talking about non-US persons, and in particular, in my experience, I quite often, I have many Japanese clients which are very cautious in investing into Russia or going into Russia due to this secondary sanctions issue. So in its turn, Russia introduced its own counter sanctions, which mainly against countries which impose sanctions against Russia, and those sanctions are mainly concentrate on bans in specified agricultural products, raw materials, food originating from those countries, and so on and so forth. And also, speaking about the WTO, I would say that these sanctions, which now continue and they go side by side with the COVID-19 like global crisis and global situation, they very, very well illustrate the stalemate of the organization, which Michael mentioned in his speech, because of the very existence of such trade restrictions, unilateral sanctions from one state to another, is actually indicates institutional problem in the organization. And also we can of course mention trade wars between China and the US and so on and so forth. So regarding Russia, Russia became the WTO member not so long ago, only in 2012, after almost 18 years of negotiations before entering the organization. And it enjoyed the benefits for a couple of years before those sanctions regime was introduced and the general economic was affected. And currently, I would say that Russia still benefits from membership in the organization, and also it attempts using WTO as an instrument to challenge the sanctions or to resolve those trade disputes with the countries which impose sanctions. But actually the most active claimant against Russia, I would say, was recently the Ukraine, and Russia also had filed one claim against Ukraine, and well, noteworthy to mention that all those three claims, three cases which were considered by the WTO were won by Russia, and all three were related to the sanctions imposed by Russia to Ukraine or by Ukraine against Russia. And I think that it's not so interesting to go into those cases details, but I would say that Russia, in its defense in those proceedings, used the same provision mentioned by Kathleen, which refers to the fact that a country may impose such measures if another WTO member, in case the situation affects the security of the country. So that's Article 21 of the GATT. So generally, I would say that the situation is quite severe for Russia with respect to sanctions, but Russia already learned how to live in such environment. And unfortunately, we do not see now how this situation can be resolved. Whoever will be the president in the United States, we do not see how it may change the situation with respect to sanctions, especially provided the special legislation in the US, which actually binds the president to impose sanctions or to uphold already imposed sanctions. So that's maybe all from my side.
Thank you, Georgie. I'd like to go back to an idea that Ling Sheng mentioned when we spoke to him last. He said, despite this grim outlook of international trade that we've heard throughout the panel, China's going to keep pushing forward for openness and further deepening global trade. I'd like to ask Vera, what are her views? What does she think China's role in the region, Latin America, in terms of trade and investment will be in the foreseeable future?
Yeah, thank you, Carlos. This is a very important question, and very interesting to let you know that, well, China has become more and more important for Latin American countries in terms of trade, both in terms of trade and also investment. And it tends to remain in this position in the future. I don't see a different future, let's say. This is what's going to stand for a long time. Well, just to give you some examples, China is the main trade partners of a number of Latin American countries, if not all of them, I would say. China, for example, is the main partner of Brazil for the last 10 years. However, Brazil represents no more than 3% of the imports into China. So that you can see how imbalanced is the relationship in the end of the day. The trade flow between China and Brazil last year was 115 billion US dollars, and it's higher this year. So Brazil keeps selling commodities, oil and iron, and imports industrialized goods from China. And China is also the main partner of Argentina, for example. So despite of the fact that of Mercosur and all the tariff preferences and the fact that Brazil is just the neighbor country, China is the main partner of Argentina as well. China is an important investor in Latin American countries. So, for example, in Brazil, in the energy, oil sector, and perspective of other infrastructure projects. So we are saying that we are in an economic crisis, but the Chinese is going to come as investors and buy the companies that need some help here. And the same, I'm talking about Brazil, but it's happening in I would say all the other countries as well. So it's it's the main foreign investor in Argentina and in Paraguay, in agricultural projects, industrial projects, and in Uruguay, for example, in the automotive sector. So we are talking not only about infrastructure, but in other projects as well. And one of them is, we call the attention for the agricultural projects, because those commodities that China needs to feed their people. And finally, talking about investments, there is a Belt and Road Initiative, which concern massive investments in financing in infrastructure to strengthen the logistics for the supply of raw materials of all kinds to China. So there is a strategic for China to invest and to finance those infrastructure and agricultural and related projects in distant countries like the Latin American ones. And just to have an idea of how strong it is in Latin American, the following Latin American countries have already executed Belt and Road Initiative agreements: Antigua and Barbuda, Barbados, Bolivia, Chile, Costa Rica, Cuba, Dominican Republic, Ecuador, El Salvador, Guyana, Jamaica, Panama, Trinidad, Tobago, Uruguay, and Venezuela. And they are trying to approach Brazil, Argentina, and other countries as well. So those agreements, they are opportunities to develop infrastructure in developing countries, because the China brings resources, money, and technology sometimes for those projects. But the projects are given as a guarantee for the debt. So there is a relationship of power between China and the poor countries. So this is very important to keep in mind for the future as well. Thank you, Carlos.
Thank you, Vera. Yes, we're witnessing in Latin America that expansion of investment and trade in China over the last decade. We somehow ended up in the Silk Road when we were never there, but it's expanding. And with a little closer to home, maybe Georgie can comment what's Russia's view on China's expansion and its role in the region in Eastern Europe and the eastern provinces of Russia, and how the Silk Road or Belt and Road Initiative, what kind of role does this play?
Yes, sure, Carlos. Of course, China is a leading, maybe the world's largest economy currently, and of course it dominates the region and Asia in general, and Russia considers China to be one of its key and the most important trade and even strategic partners. I would say that Russian-Chinese relations in this regard are kind of bifold. So on one hand, I would say, speak from the Russian perspective mainly, of course. So on one hand, after the Ukrainian crisis, Russia proclaims its so-called turn to the East, seeking for trade partners and investors from Asian states, from China, from Japan, Korea, Malaysia, and so on and so forth. And relations with China became more and more important during the recent years. So in 2018, the share of China in the Russian foreign trade was around 15%. In 2019, it became already 16%. And in comparison, all the CIS countries, like consisting of former Soviet republics, not all of them, of course, are collectively have around 12% of share. But interesting again, the EU is 44%. In 2020, those figures for China dropped due to pandemics, but actually not heavily, by around maybe 8%, which indicates that if we didn't have this COVID-19 issue, otherwise we would see quite substantial growth in the trade between the countries. Also, for Russia, the volume of Chinese investments is very important. Although the China is behind the US in this regard, but still. And main sectors for the investors are, of course, energy, agriculture, and automotive industry. Just one noteworthy project is the gas pipeline, which is aimed at delivering natural gas from Russian Siberian gas fields to China. It's called Siberian Power. It was launched in the end of 2019. And currently around 60 large investment projects for approximately 2.5 billion of US dollars are implemented with Chinese participation in the Russian Far East. And of course, the Silk Road initiative may not come across Russia, because if we look on the map, we see that Russia and the CIS region is in between China and the EU, and the main idea of the Silk Road is to connect China with the European Union with the most maybe effective and short road, which actually includes not only the ground communications and roads, but also the utilization of the Northern Sea Route, which actually the entire length of this sea route is nearby the Russian seashore. So, and Russia, I would say, feels itself quite comfortable with this initiative, because that the cooperation between Russia and China in this regard, it results in the implementation of several important projects for improvement of Russian infrastructure, in particular improvement and reconstruction of transportation terminals, seaports, motor roads, and several bridges and railways in Russia. And those are driven by several financial institutions which were established with the Russian participation, including Asian Investment Bank and Russian Chinese Investment Fund. So we believe that Russia will benefit in a long-term run from this Silk Road initiative, being a hub for the transportation of cargoes and so on. So that was on one hand, but on the other hand, Russia is keen to hold its ground in the region. And in this regard, I would say that Russia still is the driver of economic integration processes on the territory of the former USSR, of course, for the exception of several republics which choose their own and different way. So on May 2014, Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan signed the treaty on the establishment of the Eurasian Economic Union, with Armenia and Kyrgyz Republic joining in 2015. And that's economic union also contemplates establishing a single custom zone, which was already implemented and established. So that would be all from my side. This question, I hope I answered it. So, Carlos.
Thank you, Georgie. Thank you. Wrapping up, we've extended our hour. We had a couple of questions in the chat room, but they've been addressed during the presentations. Summing up, grim outlook with cautious optimism. Trade system is going to be interesting to see how things develop over the next couple of months. If there are no further questions from from attendees, I think I'll just hand it over to Hannah to wrap things up. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Carlos, and thank you to all of our panelists, Kathy, Vera, Michael, Georgie, and Ling Chen. We really appreciate them taking their time to share their thoughts with us today. And of course, thank you everyone for attending this morning or afternoon, evening, whatever time it is for you. I did just want to make a quick note about our fall e-conference that we will be hosting October 27th through November 13th. If you haven't received any information about that, we have several sessions throughout that are open to the public. If you're interested, please feel free to email me and I would be happy to get you the information for that. But with that, I will go ahead and close out the session, and thanks everyone for attending.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye. Have a nice day.